Welcome to all to this video today where we're going to follow Paul going from Jerusalem to Caesarea for his trial. My name is François Blanchette and I'm happy to see you again. If you were here last time at the end of the previous video, we saw that Claudius Lysias, who was he? Claudius Lysias was the commander of the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. And what he did, he had transferred Paul to Caesarea. He did that at night, also protected by a sizable military escort. And we're going to see why. Claudius was convinced that after investigation that Paul was not guilty of any of the charges advanced by the Sanhedrin and the elders in Jerusalem. So he could have just released Paul, but why did he send Paul over there to Caesarea? Well, because he discovered that the Sanhedrin were complicit in a plot to kill Paul, and it became necessary to transfer Paul to Caesarea to Felix, the governor, in order to protect his life. So Claudius sent Paul to Caesarea, where the governor Felix had his palace, and it was also the administrative complex and the capital, if you will, of Judea at the time. And the Romans, in their management style, allowed the Jews to conduct court and their own trial and own cases, especially those pertaining to Jewish law. And Paul would have been tried in Jerusalem in such a case, but Claudius, as I said, knew that Paul will not have received a fair trial in Jerusalem, probably just killed without a trial. Also, another factor very important in this case, it's because Paul was also a Roman citizen. So it was imperative that he be afforded all of his legal rights. That explains why we see Paul before Claudius Felix in Caesarea. Felix served as the governor over all of Judea in AD 52 to 60. He was appointed by Emperor Claudius. So if you notice, the three people I just mentioned the names, all of them have the name of Claudius. So it seems that it was a very popular name at the time. So upon the arrival of Paul under escort, Felix read Lysias' explanatory letter that he sent along with the soldiers, and he placed Paul under guard in the prison of Herod's palace to await his accusers. He then sent a messenger back to Jerusalem and summoned Paul's accusers, the Jewish people from the Sanhedrin and the elders, to come to Caesarea so that the case could go on trial. Ananias was the high priest, and he was accompanied with some elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. And they all arrived from Jerusalem to Caesarea 5 days after Paul's arrival. And Tertullus, the lawyer, began by praising Felix, well, as a good and wise governor, as he wanted to show respect, yes, but also to get on the governor's good side, I guess. Then he proceeded with the charges against Paul. He called Paul a plague and an agitator of Jews throughout the entire Roman Empire and a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. The Nazarene sect was the term used to simply designate followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that Paul had attempted to desecrate the temple, which was not true. So he worded his accusations to make Paul as a provocator who was responsible for inciting riots in Jerusalem. So Felix listened to that, and he allowed Paul to speak and offer a defense against the charges. So Paul refuted their accusations, of course, and he encouraged Felix to investigate the evidence to verify whether their accusations were true. So Paul recounted that he had been in Jerusalem for only 12 days and that he came for the purpose of bringing gifts to his people. You remember Paul had organized a collection in Greece for the poor people in Jerusalem. So that's basically one of the reasons why he was in Jerusalem. And he made clear that he was in the temple to worship as part of a ritual purification rite and not to engage in arguments or try to stir up any disturbance. So the claim that Paul made in regards to the disturbance was when he said to the Sanhedrin, "Today I am on trial before you concerning the resurrection of the dead." It's something that we can read in Acts 24, verse 21, which by itself didn't constitute a criminal offense. So since Paul was a Roman citizen and nothing in his testimony indicated any guilt, Felix needed more evidence. So he adjourned until he could meet with Claudius Lysias. So the governor of Judea had to be considerate with the Jewish high priest and the Sanhedrin, as they had political power and also the ability to incite the Jewish masses to revolt. So that was kind of a difficult situation for him. And in fact, some governors in Judea learned this the hard way and were removed from their function by Rome for these reasons. As a side note, we can read in Acts 24, verse 27, that 2 years later, this happened to Felix himself when he had mishandled a conflict between the Jews and the non-Jews in Caesarea, which resulted in his recall back to Rome by the Emperor Nero, then replaced by Porcius Festus, that we're going to see later on. So let's go back to our story. So we have Felix, who returned Paul to prison, but it was a much more relaxed confinement now that allowed for Paul's friends to tend to his needs. Why? Because Felix understood the scope of the accusations and that Paul was definitely not a danger for anybody. And several days later, when Lysias arrived in Caesarea, he must have met in private with the governor, as there's no mention of Lysias in the narrative anymore in the book of Acts. So Lysias most likely confirmed Paul's version of the events, and Felix would have known Paul was innocent. So at that point, Felix could have simply let Paul go, but as we know, unfortunately, the Jewish high priest and the Sanhedrin had political power and also the ability to incite the Jewish masses to revolt, and Felix didn't want to deal with problems which would have been echoed in Rome and would have probably cost his job, which it did anyhow. So Felix was in a difficult situation. He could not legally punish an innocent Roman citizen without himself receiving repercussions. He also couldn't afford to spark any Jewish uprisings. So he decided to not render a verdict and just hope the problem would just go away by itself. So he also hoped that Paul would offer a bribe for his release, which he did not. We see that in the Bible. So Paul remained in prison for 2 full years in Caesarea because Felix couldn't deal with any decision. So Caesarea, until Claudius Felix was replaced 2 years later by Porcius Festus as the next governor, which we read in Acts 24:27. So he was appointed, Porcius Festus, by the Emperor Nero, as we said above. So Porcius Festus was a man of action, and upon arriving in Judea as the governor, the new governor, he went immediately to Jerusalem and met with the chief priest and the Jewish leaders in order to establish or probably re-establish good relations. So we read that in Acts 25:1. Why? Because of his predecessor being removed from having problems with the Jews, and Festus probably had been briefed about his predecessor's clash with the Jewish leaders. So nevertheless, Festus goes to Jerusalem and meets with the chief priests and the Jewish leaders. And it is in this meeting that, amongst other subjects, the Jews took the opportunity to list Paul as one of the issues needing resolution. Don't forget, Paul had been in jail in Caesarea for 2 years by then. So they made case against Paul as an agitator, a traitor, and a heretic. They asked Festus a favor to transfer Paul to them in Jerusalem so he could stand trial before the Sanhedrin. So we know that they secretly planned to ambush Paul and kill him along the way. Acts 25:3 gives more details. But because Paul was a Roman citizen, Festus had a legal obligation to ensure he was allowed the full rights of Roman jurisprudence. So Festus declined their request to transfer Paul to Jerusalem, but he said, "I assure you, I will reopen the case as soon as I return to Caesarea," and encouraged Paul's accusers to attend the trial. When back in Caesarea, Festus lived up to his word, so he ordered Paul to be brought in for questioning. Acts 25 gives you all the details of that scenario. Paul was led in chains to stand before Festus. A group of Jewish leaders made accusations against Paul, but they couldn't produce any evidence to support their charges. So Paul was allowed to defend himself and simply said, "Neither against the Jewish law, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I sinned in any way." As procurator, Festus had access to the court proceedings, the reports, and the findings of Felix, his predecessor, so he likely knew that his predecessor believed Paul was innocent. Despite this, Festus wanted to do a favor to the Jews and was looking for a way to please them, so he turned to Paul and he asked him if he was willing to go to Jerusalem and be tried there. Paul clearly perceived what was going on here between Festus and the Jews, and he knew that he would not get a fair trial in Jerusalem. So what did he do? Paul declared, "I appeal to Caesar." In the Roman law, if a Roman citizen invoked an appeal to Caesar, the magistrate, Festus, could not sentence him and was obligated to send him to Rome, because the punishment was death for any magistrate who would have violated this right of citizenship. Paul was now legally under the full force of Rome's protection, and nobody could do anything to him. Paul was guaranteed that he would testify in Rome, remember, just as Jesus had promised in Acts 23:11. So Festus officially suspended the trial, and all he had to do was to compose a letter explaining the nature of the case and its history to date. The Jews returned to Jerusalem, and Paul remained in custody until arrangements could be made to send him to Rome. So before Paul can leave for Rome, King Herod Agrippa II and his sister/lover, Bernice, come to visit Festus. The new governor Festus, not being as knowledgeable about the Jewish religion as his predecessor Felix, and also knowing it would be absurd for him to send a man to trial in Rome with no official charges, so he took the opportunity to speak with King Agrippa and ask for advice. That's in Acts 25. Paul gives his testimony to King Agrippa. Unlike Felix, who wanted a bribe, or Festus, who does not understand much of what's going on, King Agrippa immediately judges that Paul is completely innocent of any official wrongdoing. So he tells Festus, this man, speaking of Paul, could have been set free right now if he had not appealed to Caesar. This is one more example that Jesus is in control of all circumstances. Why? Because Jesus told Paul in Jerusalem that he will share the gospel in Rome, and as promised, Jesus provided the mean to do so through the string of events. For example, had Paul met with King Agrippa before appealing to Caesar, he would have been released and probably not have been able to afford the long and costly trip to Rome. Despite Paul's innocence and Festus' lack of any real charge, Paul had appealed to Caesar, and Festus must send him. Once in Rome, Paul spends 2 years under house arrest, chained to a guard, but he is finally in the city, where he had longed to be for years. Paul had written that a few years before in his letter to the Romans in chapter 15. And while there in Rome, he had the opportunity to write some of his epistles as well. You know, no other account exposes the heart and the character of Paul better than this arrest, imprisonment, and trials in Jerusalem and in Caesarea. Even on his journey to Jerusalem, we see his willingness to suffer and die in faithfulness to Jesus Christ. Why? Because we have seen in previous videos that he had been advised that he's going to be suffering and be arrested in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, he trusted in Jesus and he just went. We have already seen how he never backed down from difficulties during his missionary journeys. Stay tuned for our next video where we will follow Paul traveling as a prisoner on this long voyage to Rome, and both Luke and Aristarchus were allowed to accompany him. Luke's presence is implied by the use of we in Acts 27. So Luke, as we know, wrote the book of Acts, and in that chapter he narrates, or he tells us what happened, and he says we, and in many places. So he was part of that the trip to Rome. He possibly joined them as a physician, because Luke was a physician, and the Romans probably said, okay, we're going to have many people on the ship, so he probably joined them as a physician for Paul and the other passengers. The Bible doesn't say, but we know that he was there. I thank you for watching once more and hope to see you soon. God bless you all. Thank you.